The death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg stands to impact a number of cases currently on the Supreme Court docket, including a case challenging the Affordable Care Act. The Supreme Court is expected to hear arguments challenging the constitutionality of the law a week after the presidential election in November. But President Trump has vowed to put a new conservative Supreme Court justice in place well before then. Jess Bravin joins me now. He is the Supreme Court correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to you, Jess. Thanks for being with us. What is the legal argument for striking down President Obama's signature health care policy, and who's behind that effort?
Well, as you might recall, the Supreme Court has upheld the Affordable Care Act, or most of it, on several occasions. After President Trump was elected and the Republicans controlled the Senate, they did consider repealing the Affordable Care Act, but ultimately did not. However, what they did do in their tax bill was reduce the tax penalty for not carrying health insurance to zero. And as some viewers might recall, the constitutional justification for upholding the act, written by Chief Justice John Roberts, was that Congress was acting through its power to levy taxes. After Congress reduced the tax penalty to zero, without eliminating it, but reducing it in that way, several conservative-led states filed suits arguing that the Affordable Care Act now was unconstitutional because it no longer had in it a tax. There was no longer a tax penalty, therefore no taxing power, therefore no federal authority to impose a mandate to carry health insurance. Therefore, the entire Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. Federal courts in Texas and the appeals court in New Orleans agreed with that argument to a point. They said that the individual mandate to carry health insurance is now unconstitutional because there is no tax penalty. They left open whether the entire law must fall or only part of it. That decision is now on appeal to the Supreme Court. It is being appealed by California and a coalition of liberal-leaning states. That's the argument that's before the Supreme Court right now.
And help us understand, what was Justice Ginsburg's role in getting to this point where we are now legally when it comes to the Affordable Care Act?
Justice Ginsburg did not write any of the major opinions upholding the Affordable Care Act, but she was one of the 5 or 6 votes in different cases that did uphold that act. So she was an essential player. When you have a 5-4 decision, every vote matters. So the opinion upholding the entire act as under congressional taxing power was a 5-4 decision. Now there are 8 members of the Supreme Court, and almost certainly there will still be 8 members when this case is heard in November. With the Supreme Court, we're to divide evenly 4-4. In other words, assume that Chief Justice Roberts, who upheld the act under taxing authority, were to again uphold it, or this time around, then he would join almost certainly 3 liberal justices' votes. So you have a 4-4 tie. That means that the lower court opinion stands. The lower court, in this case, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, found that the individual mandate to carry insurance is unconstitutional because the tax was reduced to zero. So that's what would happen. The individual mandate would disappear. And then the question would be whether the entire Affordable Care Act, which includes an expansion of Medicare coverage Medicaid coverage for lower-income Americans, protections for those with pre-existing conditions, and many, many other changes, whether the entire thing goes into the dustbin or only part of it. And that would still remain to be resolved. It's possible the Supreme Court could resolve that issue itself, or it could be returned to the lower courts.
Is there any reason to suggest, anything to indicate, rather, that Chief Justice Roberts might decide differently than he has in the past? Or is it very likely that there could be a 4-4 tie?
Well, a 4-4, I think that a 4-4 tie is a strong possibility. And that, in a sense, that keeps the Supreme Court out of it for now, because it would return to the lower courts, and whatever the lower courts decide could then be appealed, and presumably at that later time we would have a 9-member court, which could then address the remaining issues. So, we don't know how the Chief Justice is going to look at this particular issue. We don't know for sure how any of the other justices will, but we do know that there are members of the court who are very, very skeptical of this law in the first place. and probably will think that it was on flimsy constitutional grounds to begin with, and now this maybe pull the entire floor out from under it. So really, though, this is maybe the most significant case right now that is going to be affected by her death. Because if there were 4 liberal votes on that court and Chief Justice Roberts were to disagree with the findings of the lower courts, then the issue would be done with, and we would have the Affordable Care Act upheld flat out. Now that seems much, much less likely.
Well, in your article, Jess, you detail some of the emergency applications the court has gotten related to government-ordered public health measures intended to combat COVID-19. What impact might Justice Ginsburg's death have on how the U.S. handles the coronavirus pandemic moving forward?
Well, there too, we are seeing the possibility of a number of 4-4 splits on the Supreme Court. And when that happens, the lower court opinion stands. And the deciding vote has really been, again, here, the Chief Justice. What we have seen in general is that the conservatives, when they have had to vote on this, the 4 most conservative members of the court voting generally to block public health measures that have been instituted to fight the pandemic, whether those measures were adopted by a state government, such as a public health order by a state governor, or imposed by a lower court that is acting in response to a lawsuit by prison inmates or others who say this government is not protecting us as much as it's supposed to, or in voting cases. Courts have ordered in some states extra provisions to, extending deadlines for counting ballots, that sort of thing. Conservatives on the court have been hostile to all those or most of those measures. Liberals on the court, in contrast, have been very sympathetic to those and have voted almost always to uphold a public health measure, whether imposed by a state government or by a lower court. The Chief Justice has gone his own way. He basically says whatever the local elected or state elected officials want is okay with me. So he will uphold their decisions, even if a court has ruled against them. And sometimes that has left public health measures intact. Sometimes it has struck them down. Usually it's struck them down, but in some cases it has left them intact. If now without Justice Ginsburg there, the odds are that you could have a 4-4 split if the Chief Justice joins the 3 remaining liberals on the court, and that would leave intact whatever the lower court had done. So again, it's going to be a significant impact we can see going forward right away. Same thing with election measures. There are going to be a lot of election cases, or at least a fair number, coming up as November approaches. And the Supreme Court may have to rule on disputes over voting and polling place locations or how to count ballots, all those sorts of things. A 4-4 split leaves the lower court opinion intact. And that's really the only situation we could imagine that would be affected by Justice Ginsburg's death, because otherwise you've got a 5 conservative member majority there. So it is it's sort of cold to look at it as just purely a numbers game. But these justices have voting patterns. We can predict, based on what they've written and what they've said about their views of the law, how they are likely to vote in many kinds of disputes. And that is what it comes down to.
Such tremendous implications here. Jess Bravin for us. Jess, thank you very much.
You bet.